When most people hear the word Viking, the same image appears in their mind immediately. A horned helmet, a shaggy beard, an enormous axe, a wooden ship with a dragon's head on the prow, cutting through grey northern waves. Savages from the north who came, killed, plundered, and disappeared back into the fog. This image is convenient, it is simple, and it is almost entirely wrong, because Vikings were not what they seem. They were more complex, more contradictory, and in many respects more significant than any Hollywood film dares to show. They were merchants and explorers, lawmakers and poets, navigators so skilled that their achievements at sea would not be surpassed in Europe for several centuries more. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They founded cities that still exist today. They created one of the most sophisticated legal systems of the early medieval world. They traded with Arab caliphs and Byzantine emperors. Their ships sailed up Russian rivers and reached the Caspian Sea. Their poets composed verse of such technical complexity that modern linguists still argue over its interpretation. And yes, they also raided monasteries. But that is only one page of a very long and very rich book. This is the story of who the Vikings actually were, where they came from, what drove them, how they lived, what they believed, what they built, and why their era ended exactly as it did. And along the way, you may find yourself discovering a people you thought you knew everything about, and knew almost nothing. Let us begin with the land, because it is the land, or rather its absence, that explains everything else. Scandinavia in the 8th century was a place both harsh and beautiful at once. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, long fjords cutting into the coastline like axe blows, cliffs dropping straight into the water, dense forests unsuitable for farming, mountains occupying most of the peninsula and leaving only narrow coastal strips for cultivation. Winters that lasted so long they seemed eternal. For months, darkness covered the world, and the sun appeared for only a few hours each day. Short but fiercely fertile summers when everything had to be done at once. Sowing, harvesting, stockpiling, building, repairing, before the darkness returned. Land was scarce. Good land was scarcer still. Under Scandinavian law of the time, land was divided among sons, and with each generation the plots grew smaller. Younger sons inherited nothing, or next to nothing, and the sea, endless, grey, terrifying sea, lay just beyond the threshold. It frightened, it killed. But it was also the only road that remained open for those who no longer had room on the shore. It was from this pressure, demographic, geographic, economic, that the Viking Age was born. Not from innate cruelty, not from any particular love of violence, from necessity, from the simple and merciless fact that there were more and more people and no more land, and someone had to find a way out. The Vikings found it in the sea, but to go to sea, you need a ship. And here the Scandinavians accomplished something that can rightly be called one of the greatest technical achievements of the Middle Ages. The long ship, the Drakkar, was a work of engineering art that was centuries ahead of its time. Long and narrow, with a flat bottom that allowed it to navigate shallow water and travel up rivers where no other ship of the era could go. The draft was so shallow it could float in less than a meter of water, meaning it could appear literally anywhere there was water, light enough to be hauled ashore and dragged overland from one river system to another. The Scandinavians called this a portage, and it was precisely how they crossed the watersheds between the river systems of Eastern Europe, strong enough to cross open ocean in a storm. The hull was built using a clinker technique, where planks overlapped each other, creating a flexible yet sturdy structure that did not break under the force of waves, but bent with them. Symmetrical, identical at both ends, allowing an instant change of direction without turning around, which was critically important when maneuvering in narrow fjords or evading pursuit. Building a longship was a craft learned over years. Shipwrights passed their art from generation to generation and were held in enormous respect within Scandinavian society. The finest ships were works of art, decorated with carvings, painted in vivid colors, with prow figures in the form of dragons or serpents that were believed to ward off sea spirits. When such a ship appeared on the horizon, it carried with it not only threat, but beauty, a strange, terrifying beauty of an entirely functional object. This was not just a ship, it was a key, and it opened doors across the entire known world. The Viking Age is generally considered to have begun in 793. On that June day, a small band of northern seafarers landed on the island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, and sacked the famous monastery, killing some of the monks, seizing others to be sold into slavery, and carrying off everything of value: gilded manuscript covers, silver vessels, jewelry. For Christian Europe, it was a shock of such force that contemporaries described it in apocalyptic terms. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin wrote in a letter to the Northumbrian king that in all the time Britain had existed nothing like this had ever happened, that pagans had defiled the sanctuary of God himself, that it was a sign, a warning, the beginning of the end. But for the Scandinavians themselves, Lindisfarne was simply the first successful raid. Monasteries sat on the coast, were wealthy, poorly defended, and expected no attack from the sea. From the perspective of practical military logic, an ideal target, no demonic strategy, no particular hatred of Christianity, simply people with an acute need for resources who found the most efficient way to obtain them. What followed changed the shape of Europe. Over the following decades, raids spread like fire. Ireland suffered blows so savage and systematic that Irish monks in their manuscripts prayed to God for bad weather, the only thing that kept Viking ships in port. France was hit so hard that in 845 a Danish chieftain named Ragnar led a fleet straight up the Seine to Paris and extracted an enormous ransom from the French king to leave. The English kingdom of Northumbria fell. Mercia fell. East Anglia fell. By the 870s, most of England was under Scandinavian control, a territory that entered history as the Danelaw, the area of Danish law. Charlemagne, the greatest ruler of his age, personally inspected the coastal fortifications of France. English monks added a special line to their daily prayers: "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord," and spoke it with a feeling far removed from rhetorical exaggeration. But while some Vikings were plundering Western Europe, others were doing something entirely different. Swedish Vikings, known in the East as Varangians, from a Scandinavian word meaning one who has given an oath or member of a brotherhood, moved not westward but east and south, along the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Neva, the Volkhov, the Lovat, the Dnieper, the Volga. They penetrated deep into the continent, reaching the Black Sea and the Caspian. This was an undertaking of enormous scale and complexity. The rivers were not always navigable along their full length, between water systems, ships had to be dragged overland, sometimes for dozens of kilometers. The rapids on the Dnieper were so dangerous that the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitos described them in detail in his treatise, how the Varangians unloaded their ships, carried cargo on their shoulders, led enslaved captives along the bank, and dragged the vessels across the rocky riverbed or carried them by hand. At the end of these routes, two of the greatest cities of the known world awaited them: Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, which the Scandinavians called Miklagardr, the Great City, and Baghdad, capital of the Arab Caliphate. In both cities, Scandinavian merchants traded furs, amber, wax, honey, and slaves in exchange for silk, spices, precious stones, and above all, silver. Arab dirhams, silver coins of the Caliphate, are found in hoards across Scandinavia in staggering quantities. Sweden alone has yielded more than 85,000 Arab coins. These are not random finds. They are the traces of a trade network that spanned half the known world. In Constantinople, the Varangians did something that seems unexpected for savages from the north. They entered the service of the Byzantine Emperor. The Varangian Guard, an elite military unit consisting exclusively of Scandinavians and later also Anglo-Saxons, served as the emperor's personal bodyguard for several centuries. The emperors trusted northerners precisely because they had no local loyalties, no family ties to court intrigues, no reason to betray the man they had sworn to protect. The Varangians were valued for their fighting qualities and their reputation as men who kept their word absolutely. One of the most famous Varangians, Harald Hardrada, the same man who would die at Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Guard for several years and rose to high rank before returning home to become King of Norway. The Varangian trading posts in the east gradually became cities. One of those cities was called Novgorod. Another was Kiev. Scandinavian chieftains became the ruling elite of the state we know as Kievan Rus. Rurik himself, the legendary founder of the Russian ruling dynasty, was, according to tradition, a Varangian called upon by Slavic tribes to bring order to their lands. The word Rus, according to one of the most widely accepted theories, derives from a Finnish word meaning oarsman, people at the oars. Scandinavians. This means that the very name of Russia has Scandinavian roots. This is not exaggeration and not nationalist construction. It is one of the best documented facts of early Eastern European history, confirmed by Arab sources, Byzantine chronicles, and archaeological evidence alike. In the West, something no less significant was happening. Danish Vikings were not only raiding England, they were settling it. The Danelaw was not simply occupied territory, but a fully functioning society with Scandinavian laws, Scandinavian place names, and a mixed population. Hundreds of English place names still carry a Scandinavian trace. The suffix "by" in town names, Derby, Grimsby, Ormsby, is a Scandinavian word meaning village. The suffix "thorp" means farmstead. The suffix "thwaite" means cleared land. The Scandinavians named half of England, and those names outlasted them and everything that came after. In Normandy, northwestern France, settled Vikings adopted the French language and Christianity so rapidly that within 2 generations their descendants were indistinguishable from the local aristocracy. But they kept their martial prowess. The Normans, literally Northmen, became the most formidable warriors in Europe of their time. They conquered England in 1066. They conquered southern Italy and Sicily. They took part in the Crusades. all of them descendants of Vikings who by that point had forgotten their ancestral tongue and prayed to a Christian god, but had not forgotten how to win. In Ireland, the Scandinavians founded the first true cities on the island: Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Cork, Wexford. Before their arrival, Ireland was a country without cities, its population scattered across monasteries, fortified farmsteads, and small villages. The Scandinavians brought with them the concept of the urban settlement, the trading port, the market. Dublin, founded as a Scandinavian fortress in the 9th century, became one of the most important trading cities in Northern Europe. More than 1 million people live there today. But the most audacious achievement of all was North America. And this is not a metaphor. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, the most famous exile in Icelandic history, landed on the shores of a continent his people called Vinland, the land of vines, after the wild grapes they found there. Today we know this place as the Newfoundland Peninsula in Canada. This is not legend, this is fact, confirmed by iron and wood. In 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, found at the northern tip of Newfoundland a site known as Lance aux Meadows. Excavations revealed the remains of 8 structures, identical in construction to Scandinavian buildings of that period. Iron rivets of Scandinavian shipbuilding type, a bronze pin of Scandinavian pattern, a spindle whorl, a characteristic female object indicating that the expedition included women, blacksmithing slag attesting to ironworking on site. Radiocarbon analysis dated the finds to approximately the year 1000. Vikings were in North America 500 years before Columbus. They did not stay. Conflicts with the indigenous people they called Skraelings proved too frequent and too bloody, and reinforcements from Europe were too far away. After several attempts to establish a permanent settlement, they withdrew. But the sheer fact that they got there at all, in wooden ships, navigating by stars, by the color and temperature of the water, by the behavior of birds and sea mammals, without a compass, without maps, across the North Atlantic with its storms and fog, remains one of the greatest feats of seamanship in human history. Iceland is another story deserving separate attention. When Norwegian settlers began arriving on the island in the late 9th century, they found there an almost empty land, only a handful of Irish hermit monks seeking solitude. On this blank page they created something unique. In 930, Iceland's Althing was established, a popular assembly that gathered every summer at a place called Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. Representatives came from across the island. Disputes were settled, laws were passed, verdicts were pronounced. The assembly was presided over by the law speaker, a man chosen specifically for his knowledge of the law, who was obliged every 3 years to recite the entire body of current law from memory, so that no one could claim ignorance. The Althing had no king, no church with the power to intervene in secular affairs, no aristocracy with hereditary privileges, only people, laws, and procedure. This was one of the first parliaments in the world. It worked, and it still works today. The Icelandic parliament is called the Althing, and is the oldest active legislative assembly in the world. Now for the gods. Because without understanding Norse mythology, it is impossible to understand the Norse people. The Norse religion was not simply a collection of beautiful stories about Thor with his hammer and Odin with his raven. It was a complex, internally consistent system of values encoded in narrative. A worldview that explained why the world was arranged as it was, what was required of a person, and what they could expect in return. And unlike many other religious systems, Norse mythology did not promise the ultimate victory of good. It told the truth that the world is complex, that the gods are imperfect, and that everything will ultimately end. In the beginning was chaos. From it were born the first creatures, the giant Ymir and the cow Audumbla, who licked the salty ice and gradually freed from it the first god, Buri. From Ymir's body, the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve created the world. His flesh became the earth, his bones the mountains, his blood the seas, his hair the forests. This is not a metaphor for gentle creation. This is an image of a world born from violence and dissolution, a world carrying the seeds of its own end from the very beginning. The world tree Yggdrasil, an enormous ash penetrating all 9 worlds, was simultaneously the axis of the universe and its living embodiment. At its roots dwelt wisdom and threat. 3 Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, past, present, and future, wove the threads of fate at its roots, determining the lives of gods and humans alike. No one could change what had been woven, not even Odin. Odin, father of the gods, wisest and most cunning, was not a god of power in the sense in which we usually imagine chief deities. He was a god of knowledge won through sacrifice. He gave an eye to the well of wisdom belonging to Mimir, lowered it into the water in exchange for the right to drink from the source, to see what was hidden from others. He hung himself on Yggdrasil, pierced by a spear, without food or water for 9 days and nights, to master the secret of the runes. This self-hanging was neither execution nor accident. It was a deliberate sacrifice of himself to himself, a sacrifice that opened his access to the magic of the runes, signs in which the power of creation itself was encoded. Odin never stopped seeking knowledge. His 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew across all 9 worlds every day and returned to tell him everything they had seen. He wandered the world in the guise of an old man with a wide-brimmed hat and a staff, entering into conversations with people and creatures, drawing out what he did not yet know. He knew he would die at Ragnarok, that the wolf Fenrir would swallow him. He had known this from the very beginning, and he kept acting, kept searching, kept gathering knowledge, not because it could change the predetermined end, but because knowledge had value in itself, regardless of how much time remained. For the people who worshipped Odin, this was not an abstract theological proposition. It was an instruction for living. Act, think, learn, even knowing you will die. Thor, son of Odin, god of thunder, protected gods and people from the chaos of the giants with his hammer Mjolnir. Direct, mighty, tireless, sometimes surprisingly naive. Unlike his cunning father, Thor solved problems head-on. He was the favorite god of ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, sailors. Not because he was the wisest, but because he was reliable. He came when called. He protected those who needed protection. When thunder rolled, the Scandinavians knew. That was Thor riding his chariot pulled by goats, and it meant someone was about to receive a hammer to the head. Amulets in the shape of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, were the most widespread ornaments in the Scandinavian world. They were worn by men and women, warriors and merchants, in the north and in the south. When Christianity began to penetrate Scandinavia, and some Scandinavians started wearing crosses, jewelers began making combined amulets, a cross on one side, a hammer on the other, just in case, so as not to offend any of the gods while it was still unclear whose side would win. Loki, god of trickery and deception, was the most complex and in many ways the most modern figure in the Norse pantheon. Neither villain nor hero. Something in between, constantly shifting, elusive. He was the son of a giant, but lived among the gods. He helped the gods out of predicaments that he himself had created. He changed shape, becoming a salmon, a mare, a fly, an old woman, with such ease that the very concept of his true form became questionable. It was Loki who outwitted the giants when they tried to claim Asgard for themselves. It was Loki who obtained for the gods their greatest treasures: Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, Freyr's ship. And it was Loki who arranged the killing of Baldur, the most beautiful and beloved of the gods, whom no creature in the world could harm except mistletoe, and Loki had taken care of the mistletoe separately. For this he was seized, chained in a cave, and a serpent fastened above his face drips venom onto him until the end of time. His wife Sigyn holds a bowl above him, catching the poison, but from time to time she must turn away to empty the full bowl. And then the venom hits Loki's face, and he writhes in agony. The Scandinavians said the earth shakes when Loki convulses in his chains. Earthquakes are Loki. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the end of everything, was not a warning or a threat. It was a prophecy that no one intended to dispute. Odin knew he would die. Thor knew he would die, would kill the world serpent Jormungandr, take 9 steps and fall from its venom. Freyr would fight without his magical sword. He had given it away long ago for love, and would perish at the hand of the fire giant Surtur. Asgard would burn, the earth would sink beneath the water, and then, and this is what sets Norse mythology apart from most others, the world would be reborn. A new earth would rise from the water, green and fertile. The surviving gods would find the chess pieces in the grass, the ones they had played with before time began, and would sit down to play again. 2 humans, Leif and Leifthrazir, would survive the catastrophe by hiding in the forest of Hodmimis, and would give rise to a new humanity. The end is not the end. This was the lesson the Scandinavians drew from their religion and applied to their lives with remarkable consistency. Defeat is not final. Destruction clears space for what comes next. The main thing is not to give up too soon. This worldview explains the berserkers, warriors who entered a battle trance, Björnsöker, bear shirt, and fought with a fury that felt no pain and no fear. Not because they were mad, because they had accepted death in advance. A man with nothing to lose, because he has already released his grip on life, becomes more fearsome than anyone who still clings to it. This was not pathology. It was technique. A controlled release from fear, achieved through ritual, through mental preparation, sometimes through the consumption of particular mushrooms or drinks. Berserkers were elite warriors, expensive to employ and valued accordingly. But it would be an enormous mistake to view Scandinavian society exclusively through the lens of war and violence. It would be like judging modern Germany solely by the 20th century. At home, in their fjords and on their islands, Vikings were above all farmers. The overwhelming majority of the Scandinavian population never took part in raids and never saw distant lands. They plowed the earth, kept livestock, predominantly cattle and sheep, which formed the backbone of the economy, fished, hunted, brewed ale, wove cloth, raised children. Their homes, long with a central hearth where people and animals lived together, were, by the standards of the age, reasonably comfortable. On winter evenings, when darkness stood outside like walls, families gathered by the fire, and someone would tell the sagas. The sagas are a subject that deserves wonder in their own right. The Scandinavian oral tradition was one of the richest in history. Skalds, court poets, composed verse of such technical complexity that it remains the subject of specialist linguistic research to this day. Skaldic poetry employed multi-layered alliteration, complex metrical schemes, and what were known as kennings, poetic circumlocutions in which simple things were described through elaborate metaphors. The sea, the road of Wales, or the sweat of the earth. Gold, the fire of rivers, or the tears of Freya. Battle, the storm of swords, or the game of spears. A ship, the horse of the waves, or the elk of the sea. A warrior, the wanderer of the sword, or the tree of battle. These kennings were not mere ornaments. They were a way of speaking about a world that saw connections and correspondences where the ordinary eye saw only separate objects. The sea and the whales were part of one world. And to call the sea the Road of Wales was to place it within a living system of relationships, not simply to give it a name. The sagas, prose narratives about heroes, kings, explorers, clan conflicts, were transmitted orally with an accuracy astonishing for a non-literate culture. When Icelandic scholars began writing them down in the 13th century, they found that events that had occurred 3 or 4 centuries earlier had been preserved with a level of detail that included the names of minor characters, topographic descriptions of the sites of long-past battles, and direct speech in key scenes. This was not magical memory. This was a culture that treated the transmission of knowledge as a sacred obligation. Women in Scandinavian society occupied a position sharply different from that of their contemporaries almost everywhere else in Europe at the time. They could own and manage property. They could demand divorce and receive it if a husband proved inadequate, brutal, or absent for too long. They held the keys to the household, literally as a symbol of domestic authority. In a husband's absence, the wife was the fully empowered head of the estate with all legal authority. Recent genetic studies of burials, long considered the graves of male warriors, have found that some of them belonged to women, buried with full military equipment, swords, shields, arrows, war horses. This is not coincidence and not error. It is evidence that in the Scandinavian world, the role of warrior was not an exclusively male prerogative. Scandinavians were skilled craftspeople. Their jewelry, complex interlocking patterns, animal style, ornaments in which the bodies of creatures flow into one another in an endless dance, displayed such sophistication that modern craftsmen struggle to reproduce it even with contemporary tools. Scandinavian blacksmiths mastered the technology of pattern-welded steel, a method of repeated folding and hammering of metal that gave blades simultaneous hardness and flexibility. Woodcarving decorated not only ships, but doorways, furniture, and everyday objects. Beauty and functionality in the Scandinavian world were not opposites. They were two sides of the same value. They were active traders. Scandinavian market towns, trading centers such as Hedeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden, were major international hubs where merchants came from France, Germany, Britain, and the Arab world. There they traded furs and amber, silk and glass, slaves and weapons, spices and ceramics. Hedeby, situated on the isthmus between the Baltic and North Seas, was one of the largest cities in northern Europe of its time, with a population of several thousand, an enormous figure for an era when most settlements were villages. Now for the end. Because every age has an end, and the end of the Viking Age was as complex and multifaceted as its beginning. By the 11th century, Europe was changing fundamentally. States were growing stronger. Centralized kingdoms were forming with professional armies and permanent coastal defenses. Raids that had caught coastlines off guard in the 8th century now met organized resistance. Signal towers gave advance warning. Cavalry units could reach the shore faster than raiders could withdraw. The cost of a raid was rising, and its profitability was falling. At the same time, something was happening that changed the Scandinavian world from within. Christianity. The spread of Christianity in Scandinavia was a long, uneven, and often violent process. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth accepted baptism around 960 and began imposing the new faith across his domains, sometimes by methods far removed from the evangelical. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, baptized in England and returned home with missionary zeal, smashed pagan idols, burned sacred sites, and offered his subjects a choice between baptism and death. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, continued the work with no less enthusiasm. Sweden held out the longest. Paganism survived there as the official religion until the end of the 11th century. Accepting Christianity changed not only religion, but the entire system of values and the political reality. Christian Europe was more willing to trade with Christian neighbors. Christian kings received the support of the Church, and the Church commanded enormous resources, administrative capacity, and international connections. Raiding a monastery transformed from a legitimate enterprise into blasphemy. The concept of righteous death in battle began to be displaced by the concept of sin and redemption. Valhalla gave way to heaven and hell. The last great act of the Viking Age is generally considered to be 1066, a year that compressed the end of an entire historical era into 2 battles. In September 1066, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking kings, former Varangian guardsman, veteran of dozens of campaigns from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, landed in northern England with an enormous army, laying claim to the English throne. At Stamford Bridge he met the English king Harold Godwinson, who had made an incredible forced march from the south, and attacked before the Norwegians had time to prepare. Harald Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. His army was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had come with him, 24 were enough to carry the survivors home. 3 weeks later, that same Harold Godwinson died at Hastings from an arrow shot by the Norman William the Conqueror. William, a descendant of those very Vikings who had settled in Normandy a century and a half earlier, conquered England speaking French and praying as a Christian. The irony of history. England was conquered by the descendants of Vikings, who defeated the defenders of England who had just destroyed the last true Viking. 2 blows in 1 month. The old world closed. But the Vikings did not disappear. They dissolved. They merged with the peoples they had encountered, and became part of the very Europe they had so long disturbed. Their blood runs in the veins of English and French, Russians and Irish, Icelanders and Canadians. Their words live on in the English language. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday carry the names of Scandinavian gods, Odin, Thor, and Freya. The words husband, sky, egg, knife, window, anger, die, call, all Scandinavian borrowings in English, so deeply rooted that native speakers long ago stopped noticing their foreign origin. Their legal traditions shaped the development of parliamentarism in Britain. The Icelandic Althing, a direct predecessor of the modern democratic legislature, continues to operate today, being the oldest active parliament in the world. Their trade routes, along the rivers of Eastern Europe, across the North Atlantic, around the British Isles, laid the foundations of trade networks the world used for centuries. Their navigational knowledge of the currents, winds, and stars of the Northern Hemisphere became part of the broader European tradition of seamanship. They were not monsters from the north. They were not the romantic heroes of a television series. They were people, with all the complexity, contradiction, and ambiguity that word implies. People whom circumstance placed before a choice between submission and risk, and who chose risk again and again, generation after generation. People whose culture simultaneously produced berserkers and poets, pirates and parliamentarians, conquerors and explorers. People who looked at the sea, endless, grey, dangerous, and did not see in it an obstacle. They saw in it a road. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the Vikings. Not the horned helmets, not the burning monasteries, not the war cries at dawn. The ability to look where most people are afraid to look, and to see there not an end, but a beginning. Some things do not age, even after 1,000 years.